Good morning. Sorry for the late start, everyone. Various schedule changes and technical problems. It is Wednesday, February 19th. And we are diving into funny little world in education, finance, and property taxes called land value taxes. Some years the administration puts forward a proposal related to this. This year they did not. But we thought they might, and so we started scheduling some testimony on it, and we're gonna see where that sends us. And so we have two folks to talk about that today, and then later in the morning, we are gonna review our standard miscellaneous tax bill, which is not related to education finance, which seems exciting. Have a little break. Yeah, and then we'll jump back into appraisals and education finance. So with that, Josh, thanks for joining us. Looking forward to hearing your thoughts here.
My pleasure. Okay, I'll open up my PowerPoint or my decks to let me see.
Yeah, I've heard the young people say deck, and it's only some of us that still say PowerPoint, apparently.
I'm just learning that, yes.
I just learned that last week, actually.
What is it referred to? Slide
A
deck?
deck, but just a deck. Don't even use the word slide, because slides are, antique technology. Who knows what slide is?
We can't say carousel. That's too old.
Oh.
Wow, that's an old one.
Only if there were horses and music and toss.
Used to have an opaque projector in the committee room.
Opaque projector.
Okay, back to you.
Still have
We're gonna.
Okay, well, I will shoot. I'll start, and what I'm going to do is what I've been told to do, which is sort of give a sort of not a hand puppet show about land value taxation, but to start from the kind of the beginning, where it's used, what it is, and how it could probably be used in Vermont. I do know that in the past, my office has worked with Josh Farley and several other economists at the Gund Institute. And we were looking at
UVM.
we were
I
looking
was just letting people know that was at UVM because I wasn't sure they were aware. Back to you. Sorry.
Okay. And yeah, feel free to jump in at any minute if I'm not being clear on anything. This was interesting to come back to it, but certainly we've looked at several towns in Vermont over the past 8 years, I'd say, and it's a natural, and I'll explain why and sort of the big picture and the small picture in a little bit. So we are a 501c3 educational research foundation. We're based in Philadelphia. We're committed to creating and preserving healthy communities by using a method of the property tax that is really starting to take off, even to my own shock, that I guess we've tried everything else. So trying to fix the property tax is not easy, but that's what we're here to do. CSE was originally founded as a sort of a progressive, by that I mean early 20th century progressive organization, founded in 1926 by a couple of future governors of Pennsylvania, several mayors of Pittsburgh, council people in Pittsburgh, and Congress people from Western Pennsylvania. And they started the center essentially to see if this would make sense and if we could provide objective and reliable information on whether changing a property tax system is a good idea. And as I think all of us know, property taxes are one of the third rails in public finance, and it can be a terrifying thing, but property taxes are essential, I think, and a lot of other people think in preserving communities and preserving revenue streams. And to date, we've helped 20 cities, boroughs, school districts, special districts, and so on use land value tax in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is a little unique in that we have 890 separate taxing jurisdictions. Luckily, Vermont doesn't suffer from any of that. So this actually might be easier for people to get their heads around. And I'm going to start at the very beginning. Taxes depend upon our world and what makes our world, and we believe that it comes down to three things. And a lot of classical economists would agree it comes down to three things. Labor, in other words, people's work, people's effort. They get paid, they get taxed on it sometimes they don't. And that's one leg, if you will, or stool of the three-legged stool that makes up finance and the fabric and economics of a city. The second is capital. Now, you have the products of land, and capital is deploying that. Now, capital can mean anything from money, which is how most people conceive of it, but it's also the tools that are used, for example, like infrastructure, the tools that are produced to make economies work. And there's my homely little representation of the ancient use of capital. In other words, we have the earth, we have the fisherman using tools and using his brawn and labor to create success for himself and his family, his community. Finally, our world is the land. And land can mean a lot of things. In our conversation, it's going to mean literally that, the land in a municipality and other things like the air we breathe, the water we drink, but place. And those are the three, what we think are vital components of everything. Just out of interest, I have a nice horse pasture in Vermont, but on the right, we have Frederick, Maryland, which apropos of Vermont, Frederick, Maryland was wiped out by a flood 20 years ago, and this is their rejuvenation effort that took place with some input from us as far as tax increment financing and as far as issuing bonds based upon the land value. And so what used to be rubble 25, 30 years ago is now a very nice place for Frederick, Maryland, one of our great small cities. So we have these three things, land, labor, and capital, and two of them act very differently, and they have an impact on our communities. Labor is mobile. It moves to where it's rewarded most. In other words, if I had $1 million and I wanted to invest money in the middle of the Sonoran Desert in Arizona, I wouldn't make much money. But if I placed my labor and my work in a city, there's a greater chance for reward. And capital is, again, that's mobile. It can move to where it's used most profitably. Land is very different. It's immobile. As you all know, they ain't making any more of it, as Mark Twain said. And so we think that land should be treated differently under tax policy and in a different way in tax policy than the other elements of labor and capital. Now we fund our governments through taxes. And again, taxes that are mobile can be problematic. A sales tax is the most mobile tax of all, and it's regressive. In other words, it falls generally equally upon citizens, no matter how much money they make or no matter what their station in life. And the income tax in Vermont is not bad. It kicks in at 6.6% of $48,000 of income. And that can be tough on people that are struggling in towns that are struggling. Business taxes, the same thing. They're mobile. They can be very regressive depending on how they're applied. In Vermont, I'd say business taxes are actually not too bad. They're fairly, they try to make them somewhat progressive, but a new business owner or a person trying to rehabilitate, say, a business wiped out by a flood, is going to, failing the intervention of government in assisting, is going to have to go deep into pocket, and sometimes that's just not possible. And that's how towns throughout Vermont can become weakened by the problem of business location, where to go. Finally, we have the property tax, the real property tax. And the irony is that it's the best tax and the worst tax. The property tax falls equally on things we want: strong neighborhoods, houses, communities, and businesses. And the other half of the property tax falls on land value. And the attraction of taxing land value is that you're taxing something that's not going anywhere. We hear of, I've heard of people trying to avoid taxes in all kinds of ways, or evade taxes in all kinds of ways. The land portion of the property tax can't be evaded. It's there. You can't load up a vacant lot's worth of dirt and take it from Vermont and take it to a no property tax place like New Hampshire. Can't be done. So land is the one captive species of wealth that can't be affected by tax policy. So, and again, jump in anytime if I'm doing a 101 right here. So you'll forgive me if I'm maybe simplifying it a bit. But a tax on land and no tax on buildings, which is what we believe is a good idea. It helps promote infrastructure growth. In other words, if you read Strong Towns and their philosophy, cities put in a lot of money, a lot of taxpayers' money into infrastructure, and infrastructure increases land values. And if they increase land values, we believe that those land values are subject to taxation worthy of collection. If we have the floods in Barre or Newport, and we as a government bring in capital and employ labor to rebuild those areas, what happens to the land value? The land value goes up. And our point really is that land value is something that belongs to the community / the government. And we think that's a preferred version or a preferred way of raising revenue. And market investment, we believe, should not be taxed. Sweat equity should not be taxed. If somebody rolls up their shoulders or rolls up their shirt sleeves and fixes a building, they get punished for it under the current system. So a land value tax is a model of tax efficiency. In other words, you have land value, and then you have that value being collected by the government. It's therefore a very economic tax to collect. It doesn't take a lot of administration, either on the taxpayer side or the tax collector's side. You've got your assessment. You're assuming the assessment is pretty good. And the money that comes out of that is there's a straight line between land value, tax collection, and financing government. So economically, it's easy. It's very easy to collect, and cost efficiency the same. You don't need too many accountants. You don't need too many superstructures on top of land to collect land value tax. So taxes are land and land on improvements. They're a reliable source of income, far more than any other tax. During the COVID epidemic and during the 2008 crash, sales taxes cratered first. People couldn't buy things. Income taxes cratered second because people were out of work. After a period of time, the most reliable source of income for any government at any level is the property tax. And property taxes account for about 1/3 of Vermont's state revenue. It's important, and I think people misunderstand that because property tax rates are scattered all over the state, and it's hard to come up with a one size fits all notion of what the tax can do. A property tax can also influence development patterns. In some towns in Vermont, taxes are so high that it's much easier to sit on land or to let buildings fall apart and just wait. And waiting is something that no state or locality certainly can afford. I know that it's going to take a while for Barre to recover from years of disinvestment and also years of absentee ownership. I was following the fate of the J.J. Newberry store on North Main Street, which has been sitting vacant for a decade or so. And the problem with that is that it still is taking city services. It's falling apart and the assessments are dropping. But the government in Barre is forced to come up with a deal for the landowner to get that land back into use, to get that building back into use, or to demolish the building and put up something that should be there. So we believe that the land value tax can take the place of not economically corrosive existing taxes. In Pennsylvania, as I said, we have so many local taxes that land value tax towns have taken to eliminating nuisance business taxes and to put the revenue need totally onto the land value portion of the property tax. Yes.
Before you go on the last slide, you said property tax is 1/3 of Vermont's state revenues. Are you thinking of just the education fund, or are you thinking in total?
In total, towns and education.
Okay.
So it's a lot of money. Most people, of course, don't consider city property taxes as a drag or a significant factor, except if you're in that town. But in the overall, it's about 33%. And I got that from our pals at Gund. And looking at the state budgets, I see that it's close to that. That's Barre. And that's what I would like to actually down the road, if we follow up on this, is concentrate on that city. There are some cities that really are not in need of that much help, I suppose. But if I would go to Newport or St. Albans or Shrewsbury or even Bennington, when I was a kid, I'm from upstate New York. When I was a kid, Bennington was a very wealthy city. And Bennington is scuffling. So that's what I think we should concentrate on, is particular cities, particular programs, pilot programs to enact a land value tax. In Pennsylvania, we have about 25, 30 cities that use the land value tax. And what's interesting is that they implement a land value tax in ways that are flexible and meet their needs. The city of Aliquippa and the school district in Aliquippa, I don't know how familiar you are with Pennsylvania, but these used to be very prosperous industrial communities. And there's the analog to Vermont and its history. But Aliquippa, Clairton, Allentown, which you all know of, they have a land value tax, and they don't tax land to the exclusion of buildings. They've come up, we work with them to come up with ratios of how much land value can be used to bring in the same amount of revenue as before, but just directing the revenue from land rather than from buildings. From what I've been able to figure in the past week and a half, most towns, in other words, urbanized areas in Vermont, they get about 75% of property tax revenue, give or take, from buildings. And if one thinks about it, why do we want to get all of our revenue or most of our revenue from the things that we want? We want to bring in business. We want to bring in people. We want to fix up homes. We want to make homes cheaper. And yet most of our property tax revenue comes from those things. Very little tax revenue comes from land. A vacant lot in Barry that's worth $500,000 brings in about $1,200 to $2,000 a year in property taxes. So all that infrastructure and all that value that government creates is essentially being short-stopped by the owner of the land, who just wants to sit on property and let the property ripen or mature, which is the hip phrase now. And once the property's ripened, then they sell at a high price. And in the meantime, in the 10 years or 15 years that it's abandoned, they're contributing almost nothing to the community's functions, to the community's services. As a good example, and I don't know how I picked up on this analogy, but it's a good one. Johnstown, Pennsylvania is famous as a city that gets flooded every 30 or 40 years. And from what I know about Vermont, that's kind of a problem from 1927 up until now, floods. The problem in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, like yours, is they have a set millage rate, in the case of Johnstown, 36 mills, and they get about $1 million from land and about $4 million from buildings. Now, the buildings are in terrible shape. They're falling apart. The city's declining. The city is losing population, and the drug problems and the impoverishment are just a fact of life. But what I think is important is that how much money they get from land is a pittance. They get about 22%. And as I said, in Vermont, that's anywhere from 20% to 35% for most towns. And what a land value tax does, and you can follow along with the bouncing mouse, if you reduce the building tax rate bit by bit, and you increase the land tax rate bit by bit, you bring in the same amount of revenue. You're just changing the source of the revenue. And a lot of our cities in Pennsylvania get most of their revenue from land values now. And that's good for two reasons. It cuts taxes for homeowners and it cuts taxes for business, but it also puts the onus of taxation on those who are not doing for the city. And in many cases that I've seen so far, you've got a bunch of LLCs owning potentially valuable land. The LLCs are based in New York City or Boston, and they have no stake in having it necessarily a healthy city. And so what we want to do is we want to switch that formula on its back, flip the script, get more money from land, which is there, and whose value is created not by the landowner, but by the community. It's funny, I go to a lot of communities that are, or states that are heavily Republican, And nothing against Republicans, but they always will tell us, they've told me, government doesn't produce anything of value, which is absolutely not true. Government produces land value. And if government produces land value, it just is logical and also provable in point of fact that that land value ought to be collected and returned to the community. Some people call it land value return or land value recapture. And it's not like the city is taking something from the people. It's taking what it already has, what it's already collected. Now, again, going back to the flood metaphor, I hate to sound like Noah. The city of Harrisburg has a land value tax, and it's a pretty strenuous one. It hits hard. And in the early 80s, before Harrisburg had a land value tax, they were wiped out by a flood caused by Hurricane Agnes in 1973. And I don't know if you can see, but I think you can. There's just lots of vacant lots and a lot of, pardon my French, crappy mercantile buildings that are abandoned. They have maybe a drugstore on the first floor. After the implementation of land value tax, and along with city government being aware of the power of a land value tax, the downtown of Harrisburg has now become a pretty vibrant place. You see fairly modern high rises that have taken the place of parking lots. And you see this building here, and that's a bank. That's a PNC bank. They have stated, and they've gone to other places to testify, that they put another 4 floors on that building because the tax burden was such that it was cheaper for them to put another 4 floors on than depend on the old property tax system, because the extra expense of the property tax was gone. And here's another vision of Harrisburg from the bad old days when they were about to go bankrupt. And you see the same thing, mercantile buildings from the 1910s, a lot of junk, and then hot dog stands and hot dog shops on the first floors. That's been eliminated. And Harrisburg is no great shakes as far as a city. It's a city of 50,000 people. It's out of the I-95 corridor. There's not much else that would bring people into Harrisburg except for a favorable tax policy and a very good local government. And the local convention center is not in some suburban area. It's right in the middle of downtown in Market Square. They're very happy with it. The other way to look at the results of the land value tax is a study we did between Albany and Harrisburg. I'm an Albany boy. And when I was born in Albany, it was a pretty happening town. There was a lot of things going on. The downtown was fairly busy. And I'm showing my age. I'm 65. But starting around 1970, things really started to fall apart and people left. We went from over 100,000 people down to about 60,000 now. Harrisburg is an analog city. It's a state capital. Half of its value is tax exempt. And again, that economic competitiveness with place is not there. You know, they're not on the I-95 corridor. After bringing in the land value tax, building permits started to increase. Why? Well, did the government start pouring money into Harrisburg? To a degree, low interest loans, tax financing, but people started to rehab and build new houses on their own because in the city of Harrisburg, it became cheaper to build than in the suburbs. And I think that's a big problem that has to be overcome. and I think they've overcome it. In the years since the land value tax has expanded, the building permits per capita in Harrisburg have exceeded Albany. Nothing's much changed since these last numbers. Various other cities in Pennsylvania have a land value tax. And after implementing a land value tax, building permits increased because there was more reliance on the bare land value, and there was more of a stick, if you will, as opposed to a carrot. You had to pay a lot of money for vacant land, and so what do? You walk away from the land, which people don't really do, or you build on it, or you sell to somebody who will. And if a city provides an environment where investment in buildings and jobs is not taxed, then there's a tendency to have construction. And I guess the world beating case of a land value tax is Pittsburgh. And they enacted a land value tax in a very robust manner in the late 1970s. And if you'll recall your history, that's when the steel crash happened. And every other Rust Belt city that we measured saw, of course, a collapse in building permits and indeed a collapse in the city themselves. Only 2 other cities saw an increase in taxable building permits, and that was Pittsburgh and Columbus. Now, Columbus managed to annex most of the land around the city, so that's where their growth came from. Now, how would it really work? I don't know how many big parking lots there are. There are a lot of parking lots in Bennington, and a lot of them actually charge for parking, or they give free parking. Now, this is Hartford, Connecticut, one of your neighbors. This is used to be one of the main commercial developments. It was a Hilton Hotel from 1950 to about 1980. They demolished the whole thing. It's been vacant ever since. It's owned by a holding company in New York City. And luckily you have this, so I don't have to go through the whole thing now. But right now, the land is valued. This whole city block is valued at $193,000. And it's worth more than that, of course. But holding cost of $193,000 a year means that you can sit on that lot and charge parking. That's $20 a day. And we did a study with Hartford City Council finance staff. That one city lot, which is now just a parking lot, it's just a dumping spot for cars. It takes them 10 working days to pay their annual property tax bill. And there's no reason on earth for the owner to change that. And of course, they fight the land value tax. But imagine if some impertinent developer came in and wanted to put up a replacement building, essentially a 10-story office building. Their taxes would go from $193,000 a year to $4.5 million a year. Now, $4.5 million a year without abatements and without subsidies, it would make it difficult for them to make that choice to go into the city center or to the developed downtown, which is why most suburban type development or skyscraper type development takes place outside of Hartford, Connecticut. Under a land value tax, their bill would go to about $1 million a year. And under our program, under a land value tax, it would still be $1 million a year, but they wouldn't be taxed on the building. So you see the benefit of taxing land as opposed to taxing buildings. There's a huge difference in what the property owner has to pay. Now that, okay, I'm going to go stop sharing. I had a million slides, putting them together in kind of short notice. But essentially, I just want to stress the point that Vermont needs housing and it needs building. And the only way to do that now that I've seen are some abatement programs, and of course, your very worthy state development programs. That costs money. Money is rare. Money is going to get rarer probably. And one thing to do is, instead of funding through government investment or crossing your fingers and hoping people come in, create an environment where a land value tax can reward investment and capital. You've seen from the Urban 3 presentations that you've got a heck of a lot of good infrastructure in Vermont. You're building it continually. But who's taking advantage of it to the extent that they're actually willing to pay for it? And with the high tax on buildings and also a fairly high tax on income and wages, people are willing to wait and or put off their development decisions for a long time. Vermont should be growing, considering you're surrounded by Massachusetts and New York State. Vermont should be growing like a house of fire. Just outside of Bennington is Williamstown, Massachusetts, and Williamstown is doing just fine. There's no reason that an inexpensive at this point town like Bennington ought to have a lack of development. And the storefronts for rent in Bennington, Barre, Newport are a testament to the fact that it's just too expensive to do business and to live in these communities. Now, another, I'm going to finish with this. I think benefit of land value tax is the evidence that the higher the tax on land, like everything else in the world, if you tax something more, you're going to get less of it. Now, the supply of land stays the same, but by taxing land values at a higher rate, you're going to knock down the price of land, and you're going to knock down the imperative and the rationale for people holding on to vacant land. It's so cheap to hold on to vacant land in your urban areas that it's cheaper to do nothing or to go into the countryside. And so, again, I'd be interested in working more and doing specific studies. That's what we do when we've brought in the land value tax. We look at each parcel and give a report to city council or whatnot, and get the revenue that you need from the value that you've created, but also let the market work. And I think it's hard for the market, in my mind's eye, it's hard for the market to work at its best efficiency in Vermont communities. And the education issue is an important one. The idea of having a state property tax, if you will, is a great one. But getting people that own a big building to agree with you is kind of a non-starter, just human psychology. But the land value, again, that's a product of you. That's a product of the government. You've created it. You have every right ethically to collect it. And by collecting that land value, you can pay for a lot of good things rather than providing a subsidy for private landowners, or rather than providing a marketing opportunity for private landowners. I think a land value tax ought to be tackled on a pilot city program basis, which is what Connecticut did in 2016. Pick 5 or 6 communities. Take a look at the entire state funding system. I think that's important. I know that the state of Virginia is looking at Vermont's state funding program formula to make sure that the very rich parts of Virginia, if you're familiar with Virginia, you have a fabulously wealthy northeastern part of the state and a flat on its back, flood-ridden post-industrial part of the state. And so by making that a whole, I think that would be the way to go. Now, as far as the numbers that I've seen from Joe and Urban 3 and Heather, you've got plenty of potential revenue there. I think a simple program of a pilot program for a town or two, I'd suggest Bennington, I'd suggest Newport, places like that would be the way to go. And you could see that it would or would not work. But opposed to the other programs available in your state and elsewhere, a property tax is an annual thing. If it doesn't work, if the local sawmill, comes marching to City Hall with torches and a crowd, you get rid of it. Well, it's a 1 year thing, and you have time to back off. A lot of cities have now had it now since 1910 in Pennsylvania. They haven't backed off. And the reason for that is that it's made the town as a whole get the time that it needs to find what it wants to do, and it rewards people that do the right thing. Allentown, Pennsylvania, I see most of you are much younger than me, but Allentown, Pennsylvania was famous for a song called Allentown by Billy Joel. No, I'm not just blowing smoke.
I think most of us are older than you, but we all appreciate the good camera angles that we have achieved here. Yeah.
It's wonderful. But
And I think we all know Billy Joel.
and the song we're living here in Allentown. They're closing all the factories down. It was in terrible shape. It couldn't meet its bills. It couldn't run a deficit, but had to, of course, start borrowing. Allentown has grown to be now the third largest city in Pennsylvania. And it's had the land value tax since 1995. 90% of homeowners saw a tax reduction. And by that, I mean poor homeowners, middle-class homeowners, rich homeowners. It's a very democratic outcome.
So I think we have some questions for you if you're ready.
Please.
Okay. Representative Odie and then Representative Maslin.
Okay, I have really one question, but one thing that I didn't quite hear what you said. It knocks, did you say the land value tax knocks down the price of land?
It does. If you can hold on to a patch of land for nothing, which is the case now in Vermont, you can sit on a vacant lot and pay nothing to the city. So if that is the case, why, if you're a landowner, don't you ask for the stars as far as your selling price? There's no reason for you not to. So by putting more of an onus and a burden, frankly, a fiscal burden on a vacant lot, then there's every reason to make that price go down so that your accountant one day says, hey, what's this line item? It's getting more expensive every year as the land tax goes up. Do something, sell it, build on it. And that's really the argument behind this. In most of our Pennsylvania cities, steel companies would knock down the factory and they would leave the land and they would wait. They would wait for an opportunity. They would wait for the city to be so desperate. Say, what do you want? What do you need? And the former J.J. Newberry in Barrington is a great example of that. They're asking a pretty high price for something that's not that valuable. So that's what I mean by that. It's that there's no penalty in sitting on vacant land.
Okay, I got it.
So Representative, sorry.
But my big question is, you said you're recapturing what the government has put into the land. How can you, I don't know how to explain that. I don't understand what the value is the government's put in.
Sure. If you have read about strong towns or even looked at Urban Three's presentations, if you put in infrastructure and you put in brand new infrastructure, thanks to Biden bucks, you're making that land more attractive as opposed to land in the woods. For example, if I put up the Empire State Building in Manhattan, I would be called a genius because the land value and the location value and the transportation is so high. If I put the Empire State Building in the middle of Death Valley, somebody would recommend medical help for me. And it's the whole idea is that the value is created by the activity of the government making things safe, plowing the streets, all of that good stuff. That increases value. If I don't have a guarantee of getting my street plowed in January, it's just going to be me and a field. But if there's a guarantee of the street being cleaned, that increases inherently the sale price, the value that people are willing to bid for that site. And I think that our system does not encourage bidding for sites to the extent that they ought to be.
Thank you.
And the presentation from Urban 3 from last biennium is inside the great internet, if anyone wants to find it. Representative Maslin.
Yeah, sir, who sets the land value tax? How is that, how are land values set and how are they taxed? Who does that work?
You're putting me on the spot on one part. The assessor ascribes the land value. Hopefully, in the best of all possible worlds, the assessor will look at market sales, and that's not terribly hard to get. Arm's length market sales. If you determine if there's a building and no vacant lots, what's the replacement cost of that building? Subtract that and you'll have the land value. It's a pretty basic rule. In fact, assessors, I think, are a little too basic in judging what things are worth. But it's a tough job. They get sued the most of anybody in government. But the assessment of land value is the first step of assessment, according to the IAAO and best practice. You first value the land as if it is vacant. And then whatever's added on top, like a building, then that's added into the formula. But that's the assessor's job. And the assessors can do a good job or a bad job. In some states, they do a terrible job. If we were in Louisiana, I wouldn't even be talking to you. They don't know how to assess their property. They don't know what it's worth. That may be by hook or by crook. But because of the history of the land gains appreciation tax in Vermont and the history of turnover of land in Vermont, there's a pretty good judge of what a plot of land would be worth. And so to establish that tax rate, all we do is we take what the revenue needs are of the city and divide it by the taxable land value. Or in the case of today, you divide it by the total taxable value, land and buildings combined. But coming up with the tax rate is pretty simple. It's high school algebra, which is why a lot of assessors are high school graduates, and they don't have to be much more than that. But, with all due respect, I'm an assessor in the state of Maryland. So it's a pretty basic mathematical process. The tax rate is, what do you need, and are you going to get it? If you're going to tax a building that is operating, if it's a building that's viable, you're going to get that money. If it's not, you may not. People may walk away from land, which almost never happens. But that's really what it's a function of. It's a function of the replacement cost of the building and what the revenue is that you need for your city.
Josh, I appreciate the theoretical construct of this in a different location. I'm having trouble getting my head around how this would work in Vermont with both our statewide education fund. It seems like mixing that with municipal tax values and having them be different would be confusing. So I'm trying to figure that out, wondering if you have thoughts. And then the other sort of piece of context is that the bulk of our land in Vermont is undeveloped land, and that is by policy design, right? And so I'm curious your thoughts on sort of how those two pieces mix together in the context of a proposal like this. And then Representative Higley is going to go next.
Okay, local taxes are, that's what makes things happen. And the education system and the education funding system is a different beast altogether. I agree with that. But land in Vermont is already, in rural areas, is highly undervalued, which is a good thing because it prevents overdevelopment, it prevents sprawl. That's a good thing. But at the same time, most of the action takes place in communities. And those communities have to have a very dynamic land market. They have to have a very dynamic economy. And so I think the safest thing, and certainly the most accurate thing to do, would be to look at communities by themselves. And then look at the education fund. You see what revenue comes from the communities, and you can translate that into the education formula, which is why I understand the education formula in the first place, to make sure that prosperous communities pay the fair share as opposed to communities that cannot pay their fair share. So those are two different things. They're related. But I would start with communities, with towns, with jurisdictions, because that's where the economy is taking place. We want to leave Chester Depot alone. And we want to leave the countryside alone. And so to get those things to happen, there is an inherent land value everywhere. But with highest and best use and current use and other things in place, that's impossible. I think that Vermont is going to remain small towns and small conurbations for the foreseeable future. I see two different things happening here.
So as you answer that, what I'm then imagining is that there would be a property valuation in a municipality for the municipal tax and then another valuation in that municipality for the education tax?
I don't see how it has to be like that. I think that the education tax would be based upon the land value. In other words, where there's a very high land value in a municipality, they're going to pay their share higher relative to a rural area.
Okay.
It's going to be similar to what you have now.
Okay, Representative Higley?
Thank you, Josh. I think I heard you say that a lot of Vermont's infrastructure would currently allow for development. And I guess I'd have to counter that a little bit. There was a senator the other day at a ledge breakfast that went right down Route 15, talking about how Hyde Park's infrastructure doesn't allow any more building because of the water and sewer infrastructure. Johnson right down the road again, went right down Route 15. So I guess how would that land value be assessed when there's really no ability for the town to expand?
If there's no ability for the town to expand, and if infrastructure is not going to be there, the land value is going to be low. That's the way, that's logic. There are places where there are very low land values, and that's by design or by happenstance. But there are places of very high land value that are simply not being used to their highest and best degree. And that for some reason has a bad rap, using land to its highest and best use. You know, if I were in Arlington, we know that, you know, it's a wonderful place to visit. It's a great place for tourists to come in and drop their money. They have high land values. So those land values, again, you've created it. There's infrastructure that's there, and that infrastructure ascribes value to the land. And that's why it really has to be exploited to its at least a higher degree than it is now.
And then if I can too, Josh, you know, in talking about the rural areas, I guarantee you that most rural folks think that the property taxes on land in rural areas is extremely high. And I think I heard you say that you feel otherwise. Am I correct in that?
Tell you what, I can provide a map that shows the difference in land values between the town of Barry, or the town of Newport and the city of Newport. And the difference, the variation in land values in the city of Newport are of an order of magnitude much higher than the town. That's what I mean by that. It's the value, the desirability of this land is much higher in Newport, even though I know Newport's depressed, but the city has the bones of a town that has infrastructure, that has the possibility of growth, upward growth, vertical growth, perhaps, but we'd rather have that than growth out. You don't want people taking advantage of cheap land, cheap rural land, but it's relatively, I'll assert, it's relatively much cheaper outside of the city borders, the town borders.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
We have another witness and just a few minutes left. So I'm going to thank you very much for your time today, Josh. Really appreciate it. A lot to think about here as we continue our work.
Oh, thank you. And I will remind you, the data is out there. It just has to be plumbed. And we'd be glad to help or advise on that.
Thank you. Appreciate that. One of the things we've been talking about a lot in here is the inconsistency of some grand list data between towns. And so it'd be interesting to see what you might come up with if you were comparing them. Representative Meslin.
Could I leave Josh with a quick question that he can then respond to?
Love that.
Yes, sir, if I can.
You may understand, so we spent a great deal of time working on designated downtowns and village centers and various other kinds of stuff, and have developed a lot of policy and work around trying to support those things, right? Designated downtowns.
Yes.
And they have defined perimeters by necessity. And I'm trying to get my head around how we would work with a land value tax within a perimeter, a designated downtown, as opposed to land just outside. As you use Newport City and Newport town as example of how to work with a perimeter. I'm just curious to know if you could respond as a memo back or something like that, how we would work within the these I call them, you know, perimeter municipalities or whatever you want to call it, that we use to support growth in places where we want it and not where we don't.
And I want to thank you very much for joining us, Josh. Appreciate it. So Katie Gallagher is joining us next. She might have thoughts on that question. She's from the Vermont Natural Resources Council.
Thank you.
And Chris Cochran has been thinking about these issues for a long time, and he's the one who works on all of those designated downtowns. So he might also have some ideas for you, Jim, if you wanted to write to him. Thank you very much for joining us today, Josh.
Glad to.
Would you like to join us?
Of course, thank you so much.
Thank you. I'll open my screen. And we're
You're hoping to end at 10:30?
We can run a few minutes late. I'm very sorry about that. That's okay. How long is your presentation?
I made it so I could go longer or shorter, so
How long would you like to?
let's say I could do 10 minutes.
Oh, okay. Very nice.
Let's do it, because otherwise, I don't want to be too repetitive from what you just heard. Okay. So, thank you very much for hearing from me today. My name is Katie Gallagher. I direct the Sustainable Communities Program with the Vermont Natural Resources Council, which is a statewide environmental advocacy organization that works to protect our environment and our communities. We've been around since 1963. My program area focuses on sustainable land use planning and development. My background is in community planning and applied economics. And so this is an area that I'm particularly excited to talk about. But just to note that when I think about sustainable communities, that's from not only an environmental perspective, but also from a social and an economic perspective. And so land value taxation is something that we've been talking about, as the chair noted, for the past couple of years, as this has been something that the administration has been interested in exploring a little bit more. But it also has been around for the past couple of decades in Vermont as a topic of potential consideration. So these are just a couple of examples dating back to 1999, I think is the oldest piece I could find, where we were working with partners and recommending considering a land value tax. Most recently, you might have seen there is a report on how to incentivize affordable housing in the state, particularly as we are implementing changes through Act 181, as the topic around the designation programs just came up, and changes around Act 250 coming into place. How do we bring in more private investments, particularly in our downtowns and community centers? A land value tax was a part of this report. And just to note that with the implementation of Act 181 and those changes to community planning, and as we talk about the urgency of housing development and needs, I think that this is a really important time to be considering what other options we might have available to us. So the perspective that we are coming from the Vermont Natural Resources Council is looking at our smart growth land use goals, which are in statute in Vermont. There's a whole kind of comprehensive list of principles of what we mean by smart growth, but the kind of main takeaways that you all are probably familiar with are that we want to increase the supply and types of housing options in our downtowns and our community centers, while also kind of pulling away pressure from our working lands, our farms, our forests, our critical natural resource areas. And of course, we are facing several barriers. You heard about how the property tax system is currently, and this is the case not just in Vermont, but across the country, but incentivizing lower value development that is consuming our land and our public infrastructure. We have this housing supply crisis that is, as we saw particularly during and after COVID, made even more significant because we have the people who have the means to come in and buy up land or buy up buildings. And that can lead either to speculation or to raising those prices and the building prices even further. And then, of course, we're dealing with the fact that we are a rural state. We have very small towns. Our municipal infrastructure and resources are very limited. The amount that we have to invest in those infrastructure investments is really, those are big investments. Those are big deals for our communities when they're even able to go down that route. But the benefits of those investments are going to a select few. I just added a picture on the left here, if you can kind of see it. This is my town of Waterbury, and the building that's on the left next to the gas station, this is as you're heading into the downtown area, that was slated to be knocked down and turned to a gas station. And it was saved by the efforts of a couple different community partners, and is now a downstreet property, but it has mixed use development on the first floor. But just thinking about, what it means for our communities to have that type of investment, and how, in this case, the town of Waterbury would look so different if that building, which takes up, half of the block here, if that wasn't there, and that was more empty land. So the reason that we're interested in exploring what a land value tax could look like for Vermont is because we think that it could really advance our smart growth land use goals, as Josh noted in a couple different ways, particularly in how it can help to revitalize our downtowns and our village centers by incentivizing adaptive reuse, infill development, infill being, putting buildings into vacant lots or lots that are currently underutilized, and trying to attract more of that private investment that we really need, particularly in our smaller towns where we might not be getting those larger private developers that are going to come in and build, a 30-unit apartment building, particularly in our smaller towns. We've seen where the most success where we have community members who are dedicated to and invested in taking over either a vacant parcel or an old gas station or something like that, where they're then able to make that investment. And so this is an opportunity for them to not be taxed on making that investment into that building, but instead having a greater ability to make that upgrade to that building. So this is also helping to encourage the creation of more affordable, accessible housing. We're particularly interested in, again, that infill development and development of missing middle housing. So those are the housing types that are, we think of as missing because they, for several different reasons, including zoning and things that are not part of this conversation, but have not been a part of our recent kind of development spectrum. But those are things from duplexes to quadplexes, 4-unit buildings, again, types of housing that not only fit really well into most of our downtowns, but also are more affordable, both for the in certain cases for the developer. It's more efficient use of land, more efficient use of infrastructure, but they're more affordable types of housing for people who are looking for that type of housing, particularly thinking about our older Vermonters who are looking to downsize and looking for options to do that. We, again, really are kind of missing out on the value that we are creating by investing in making walkable streets and putting in water and wastewater infrastructure and these really costly public investments. When only a few property owners are able to take advantage of that, we're losing out as taxpayers in those potential benefits. And then I also just wanted to note, again, the kind of broader context of this conversation for us, the other co-benefits related to smart growth development. When we're able to incentivize more housing and mixed use development in our community cores, that means that we are able to then reduce the required vehicle miles traveled for people. So that means that we have fewer vehicle related accidents and deaths. There was recently a study that came out from the Agency of Transportation that actually calculated what that number could look like or would look like, lowers transportation costs per household, which I don't think that we talk about often enough, but is the number 2 usual cost for households. Increases transportation options that don't require a vehicle. It's usually like childcare, housing, transportation.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
You have to drive an hour to work each way.
Right. Yeah, so particularly for rural
Including time or
communities.
just fuel and car costs?
I think it's all encompassed. I can send the,
Oh, okay, anyway, okay,
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
It's a lot, yeah.
People drive an hour and 15 each way.
No, I understand that, but it's still buy it. Okay, anyway, sorry, now everyone's all talking at once.
I'd be happy to share more information because I think it's shocking.
More information would be great.
So having this kind of compact development, you know, just thinking about what we're seeing in the picture here, having sidewalks that are safe and walkable, that allow for more transit options, that means that people have more transportation options, so they can age in place, they don't have to rely on a vehicle, they can lower their vehicle costs, et cetera. And then finally, and really importantly, it decreases that development pressure that we currently have on greenfield development that's fragmenting our farms, our forests, our really critical natural resource areas.
Rutland?
Sorry,
Is that Rutland?
that's Rutland, yeah, yep. So this is just a really quick image that I thought was interesting to share, just another way to kind of look at this. This is coming from, it might have been our friends at Urban 3, Strong Towns, and if I know that Josh mentioned Strong Towns a couple of times, I can share more information on them. They kind of look at the question of municipal investments and whether we're getting that value back. But the question here that these images are looking at, so you have kind of a scale from residential to commercial on the left-hand side, and then low density to high density, and looking at the average revenue for the city based on the efficiency of the use of those parcels is really different. So you can see that basically our low density residential development or low density development in general is really kind of being subsidized by our higher density. And this obviously is not Vermont, but the same kind of pattern applies in most places. So just again, kind of reinforcing the reason, one of the reasons why we are prioritizing smart growth principles is because these types of mixed use walkable downtown areas are fiscally and economically more beneficial for our municipalities. Just another chart, and I can send more information afterwards, but this was work from Urban 3 looking at New Hampshire. And they produce, as folks who were here for their presentation a couple of years ago, they produced these really kind of interesting graphs that are calculating the land value per acre, and it's just a really striking visualization of what that looks like. And then in terms of potential next steps, don't need to go into it too much. Josh already kind of said everything that I would have talked about here, but we've talked about having a potential feasibility study that might look at just a couple of towns that would really kind of benefit, and we could explore, you know, we just talked about all of the reasons why land value tax is amazing, and like, but obviously it's not a silver bullet. There's a lot of other questions that we would need to answer, and that is, I think, what we would be hoping to achieve in a potential study. Also getting to the question of, and the way that in the conversations that I've been a part of, we've been talking about this, is that it would be focused on those designated growth areas. So given the kind of complexity that we have with our current use system and rural lands versus more urban centers, it might make sense to really focus this on those geographic urban cores. But again, that could be something that we look at this in a study, is whether that makes sense to have that geographically defined, or if you have it applied to a whole town. So I'll leave it there.
As someone who comes, if you go back to the map, you see the Lebanon Hanover area. The job density on the Vermont side, we are in close proximity to that job density, and that's affecting our property values. But our designated downtowns are not actually conducive to development in those regions. So even if we did use the land value tax, the development that needs to happen for smart growth could not actually happen. So just wanted to point that out, because I think if we're going to talk about this, we need to look at the zoning as well, and whether it's actually a constraining variable there.
Absolutely.
But we need to talk about job density. But the other question is, if you did a study, could you also look at transaction costs at the state level? Because we often talk only about impacts at the local level, but if this truly is streamlining and simplifying, there's value in parsimony when it works. Is that something that you see being part of the study?
I think so. I mean, I would leave it to Josh and some of the other experts to talk a little bit more about that level of detail than I would be familiar with, but I'm not sure why we couldn't explore that.
I have a question. So I read an article a month ago, maybe, where Burlington seems to be clamping down on blighted properties to free them up for some of this. And again, one of the properties that was freed up turned into a cannabis retail shop. So how do you, again, if you're talking about smart growth, that to me isn't what's needed.
Right.
So how do you adjust for that or make sure that something else other than a cannabis shop goes in?
You know, I think that ends up coming down to the municipality and either their zoning requirements or other incentives that they might be able to put in. I think that's one of the questions, right? Is like right now we have a system that's a market driven outcome, is that kind of shop is going to be able to afford that property and they're going to be able to make income because there's a demand for it. So we need to be looking at other ways. And if housing, for example, is what we want in that property, then there are going to be other places that we need to work to incentivize that. So I think these are these different steps that we're trying to get at.
Thanks.
Representative Odie and then Maslin, and then we're gonna wrap up.
Is there any way we could use tax policy to help be sure that for public health reasons, people have enough room around those buildings and enough park space and enough outdoor space and enough space just for people to be outside, not just straight onto a sidewalk?
I would say I think that's another municipal zoning level decision. For example, I know that in my town of Waterbury, we have a requirement that buildings that are multifamily buildings of a certain size need to be within a certain distance of a public park or natural resource access. So again, that's something that would be difficult to achieve at, I think, the scale that we're talking about here in terms of tax policy. I could be wrong, but I'm not familiar with examples of that.
You have the last word.
Yeah, thank you. Under your first bullet under enable. Would you suggest that we do just that, pass enabling legislation to enable some towns, areas to say, let's try this out, like it?
I would think that the first step might be a study.
Gotcha.
And then maybe the next step would be enabling legislation.
Okay.
I have a question about that. So, well, I don't even remember how many years I've been doing this, but I feel like for quite a while, there's been a request for a study on this. And I'm curious why all the folks who want this study, what do you hope from this being a legislative study versus just someone studying it? Because right now I feel like there's a big gap between my ability to understand implementation and this idea. I don't feel like the legislature needs to necessarily figure that out. I feel like probably a next phase could be just a private partner figuring this out. I just wonder after like 6 years of asking for a legislative study, if it might make sense to move forward with.
That might be the best next step. I think, you know, my first thought is that given that this is a property tax question, I would feel more comfortable having it be a legislative study that has some kind of stated guardrails around it that it's, you know, asked for and coming back to the legislature instead of advocates coming back again and saying, hey, we did this study. You know, I don't know if That's my inclination.
It's just after a few presentations about this, and I continue to think it's a very interesting theoretical idea that has all kinds of interesting implications for how we think about property taxes. I think that for many of us, it's still actually hard to get our heads around it enough to even see the value in a study. And so to make things more concrete might help us take the next step here, but we can figure that out.
Yeah. That, and I wonder if, you said guardrails, is it ever kosher for somebody on JFO to be in a, to participate in a private study, or,
JFO could staff a legislative study.
but they couldn't be one of the members sitting around the table in a private study, just,
I don't believe
In
so,
their
no. They
house.
also have, the staff at JFO who work on property taxes have, I think enough to do, right?
I won't say, I just, I thought I'd ask.
Yeah, no, and I didn't mean that as everyone laughed. I did not mean it as a joke. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, yes.
So some of our cities have their charters where they may have the ability to do this without enabling legislation, I'm guessing.
I'm not sure if they do at this.
Okay, all right. So I guess the second question, is there a minimum size community in which this is applicable? Evidence or existence of water and sewer supply would generally tend to impact that. So
I think, and I don't think there's any need to have a limiting factor. I think that that's where kind of it would be
a study would,
a study, and it would be up to towns to decide as to whether they want to pursue it. Yeah,
Thank you very much.
thank you so much.
Folks, we have a 4-minute break.
that was a